So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce Bob Thompson here. Bob's book is Revolutionary Roads. Here's my copy that I received and have read, and we're going to be talking about that. Bob and I actually have different opinions about some things about the revolution, so that is going to be fun to talk about. So, but let me tell you a little bit about Bob, who I had the pleasure to meet in person back in March at the Revolutionary War conference that's held annually down in Williamsburg. So officially, Bob Thompson is the author of Born on a Mountaintop, an on-the-road exploration of of the real and legendary Davy Crockett. As a longtime feature writer for the Washington Post and editor for its Sunday magazine, he was known for his pieces on the intersection of history and myth. So welcome, Bob Thompson. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Great. Okay. Well, for those of you who haven't read the book, let me describe it a little bit, and then we are going to get Bob to talk about the book, his overall approach, and then we'll start talking about some other questions on what he found on the road or roads, revolutionary roads. But those of you who remember a book that, and Bob, maybe help me out a little bit here. 25 years ago, maybe Tony Horwitz's book.
Tony Horwitz, you're probably thinking of the Civil War book.
Confederates in the Attic.
Confederates in the Attic.
Right. Yeah. So that goes back probably 20, 25 years now, I think. And also some of you might have read Sarah Vowell's books on her titles. I know are Assassination Vacation and a couple other, one on Lafayette and that. But this is kind of a different take and a way of looking at history and certain eras. And I think now that I'm talking about it, Bob, I believe Nathaniel Philbrick has one about looking for George Washington.
He does, yeah. It's the looking for things format is something I learned that partly from Tony Horwitz, who was a great reporter and writer and died much too young. But my take on it is a little different. When I talk about the book, I call it a kind of traveling history, where I go to places where important things happen and walk around and look at the sites. More importantly, I think, whenever I get to a key site, I try to find somebody who was a passionate scholar, whether academic or mostly not, of that particular battle or site, and got them to help me. And they would go on tours with me and walk around and compensate for the fact that when I started this book, I did not actually know a whole lot about the American Revolution. And so as I learned from these people, I often put them in the book. And so you can sort of see me learning as you go. I wrote the book first person, which anybody who's read it will certainly see. And that gives me a certain freedom to not to play fast and loose with any facts, but to be a little more interesting in some of the ways I present them, to get through the complex ones. And finally, the thing that I narrowed the book down to, which it's probably not narrow enough for my editor, but I focused on turning points. I wanted to go especially and pay a special attention to the many places where either the specific battle or the whole war as a result of it could have turned out differently. So those are the ways my books are a little different from many great narrative histories of the revolution that have been written.
So can you give us a sense on how long you were out on the road, or how many trips or how many miles that you were doing these, not only your research, you're getting out there on the battlefields, but also talking with people that you were able to identify? How long was this and what was the scale of this project?
Well, the whole book took me 8 years, which was approximately, well, it was more than twice as long as I promised my wife it would take. The most fun part actually was the first couple of years when I was traveling and meeting these folks in person. And I put 20,000 miles on the car doing that. So that'll give you some sense of it. I didn't do it, the book is mostly in chronological order, but I didn't do the traveling in chronological order because that would have been a lot harder. But yeah, 20,000 miles, a lot of people.
All right. So one thing, a colleague of mine has read your Davy Crockett book, and I kind of looked into that a little bit more today. And the description of the author description on your dust jacket for Revolutionary Roads says talks about that you're interested in the intersection of history and myth. So what kind of myths did you learn about the revolution while you were researching and writing this book?
Well, when I started the book, the Crockett book, to back up a second, it really is very specifically about the intersection of history and myth, because Crockett was a real human being who did real things and went real places, and I went all those places. But he also, in his lifetime, he was already a legend and became much more of one, and tall tales and all kinds of craziness. So when I started the Revolution book, I thought, well, I wrote a book about the history and myth there. I'm not going to do that again. That proved impossible. As you well know, John, you can't write about the revolution without running into myths. And, I don't know where to start. I can throw a dart at any page of the book and find one problem. Do you have any favorites?
Well, you and I both know Eric Schnitzer up at Saratoga.
Yes.
And I was thinking, I'm currently writing about Saratoga right now, or trying to, and many of the things I ask him about all debunked or partially debunked. So do you remember any of the ones from Saratoga that you want to?
Absolutely. There's many of them. One of the most interesting ones, actually, I think, is the idea that unfortunate young woman named Jane McCrae, if I have that name right, who was killed by Native Americans who were in alliance with General Burgoyne. That death really helped the other side win Saratoga, because people were outraged by it. And if there's a little museum in Fort Edward, a very nice little museum, which has a bunch of stuff about Jane McCrae, because that's near where she was killed. And there's a strong quote about how she changed the Revolutionary War. And I had some doubts about that, but after I was kind of through with most of my Saratoga reporting, I got to talk to Eric Schnitzer, who is a very excellent historian and knows more about Saratoga, I think, than anybody. And he said, no, that is a myth. Didn't have anything to do with it. And the idea had been that McCrae's death caused a lot of militiamen to come in to Saratoga, especially for the second battle, which is true that they did. A lot more militia showed up. But as Eric pointed out, in New England at least, which is not, I think, quite the same as in the South, militia were sent out by governments, and local governments, state governments, whatever, and they didn't go out if the governments didn't send them. And the governments in New England didn't want to send their militia across the Hudson River, because they thought Burgoyne's object might very well be New England itself, and so they wanted to keep their guys at home. And it was only after Burgoyne crossed the river, according to Eric, who I believe, that the militia, including John Stark, a very important militia leader at that point, started coming out. And it really had nothing to do with Jane McRae. And I said, well, how'd that happen? And that it became a myth. And he said, it didn't start with the novelist Kenneth Roberts, but Kenneth Roberts was a big part of it. That in his book, I think it's Rival in Arms, he magnified this as a cause, which is always interesting when fiction intervenes in history.
You mentioned earlier turning points.
Yes.
And that you wanted to find the turning points, which is a natural thing. I'm currently doing that as a project on my own, and being disabused of things every time I'm at it. How do you define turning points, and which battles or events do you identify as the major turning points of the war?
First of all, the definition is highly malleable. I tended to focus on turning points where things could have ended or changed negatively for the rebel side. And there are many turning points that were positive for Washington and the other people who were fighting the war. But so I kind of focused on the negative ones. It's a really long list. Mine, I just wrote down some. Mine starts with Bunker Hill, which really changed the nature of the war because the British were so banged up and mauled that they didn't want to fight that way anymore.
Right.
And the entire New York campaign is one turning point after another. And the biggest one there is when Washington managed to escape from after the terrible Battle of Brooklyn, where he was trapped. And if the wind had changed, or if the British Navy had been a little faster to move when it did change, Washington and half his army would have been captured on Long Island. And many people think that would have ended the war, and I agree with that. On and on in the New York campaign. I'm going to come back to two that I want to talk about a little longer, but Saratoga is a classic, well-acknowledged, and really incontrovertible turning point. The reason not being so much that that the battle itself ended the war, came close to it, but it brought the French in. That it provided an excuse actually for the French to do what they wanted to do, assuming that they thought it would be a good thing for them. And Saratoga kind of reassured them that might be the case. And you know, there's a wonderful battle that lasted for about 15 minutes, known as the Battle of the Clouds, which was basically a huge battle that was rained out. And it took place about a week or less after the Battle of Brandywine, where Washington and his army barely escaped. They were defeated, but they still had an army at the end of it, and it could have been otherwise. But for them to fight the Battle of the Clouds 5 days later, who knows how that would have turned out? But for them, it was a good thing it didn't. Valley Forge is a turning point for various reasons. When you go down south, there's a long list of them. One of the biggest ones, I think, is Kings Mountain, which I imagine a lot of people know about. But the two turning points I wanted to mention most, one of which is something that a few people will have, or more than a few people will have heard about, but maybe not understood how important it was, according to me. And that is not the first Battle of Trenton, which was an obvious turning point, an important one, and it's what everybody remembers. And it wasn't the Battle of Princeton, which came after that and was in its own way an important turning point, but it was the Second Battle of Trenton. And stop me if I go on too long about this, because I'm likely to, but a few days after the First Battle of Trenton, Washington, who still had an army that was mostly, their enlistments were mostly about to run out, he thought, sheesh, I better do something else with them. And he crossed the Delaware again and put himself in Trenton, not really knowing what he was going to do next. But he did know the British were going to come after him. And they did. And Lord Cornwallis, who had hoped to go back to England for the winter, was hauled off the ship and told to go get Washington. And so he was tearing down the road from Princeton towards Trenton. And the first thing Washington did was he sent out some guys to delay the British troops. And that's a long story, but they did. And the hero of that is a man named Edward Hand, who led some riflemen. But then they got to Trenton, and Washington and his men were on the far side of the internationally famous Assunpink River. And it was late in the day. And if the British had managed to get across that river, at that point, the revolution might have been toast, but they did not. And the principal reason they did not was that Henry Knox, who was the head of artillery, he brought a lot of cannon on First Trenton, but he brought more of them for Second Trenton. And they were sitting on a little hillside targeted on the bridge that the British would have to get across, and they did not. And then after that, as people may know, in the middle of the night, Washington snuck away, and the British were kind of sleeping on that. So they escaped. That's a big one in my mind. Late in my travels, I was down south and talking to a really excellent historian named Jim Pikich, who's in the book. And I said to Jim at one point, I said, well, I want to ask you a turning points question. I said, first of all, what's your choice for the turning point for the whole war? And secondly, what's your choice for the turning point in the southern part of the war, which he is an expert on? And for the first one, he said, well, I got to go with Saratoga. Everybody goes with Saratoga, but that's what it is. And here's why. And for the second one, he said, the second one is Cornwallis's decision to go to Virginia from Wilmington. And there's context for that would take a while to explain, but I was just, my mouth fell open, like what? But the short version is that Cornwallis was supposed to be making sure that the South was pacified, which it was not. And instead, he thought, I'm bored with being on defense. I don't like it down there. Let me go to Virginia and provoke a big battle and win the war. And Jim thinks, and I ended up deciding correctly, that decision was disastrous and led through a lot of different circumstances, many different circumstances, but led to Yorktown.
As I'm doing my very directed reading and starting to try to make sense of Saratoga and some other events, and you mentioned Bunker Hill. So after Bunker Hill, the British had the opportunity to crush Washington on Long Island, but didn't. They had the opportunity to potentially do the same thing at either Harlem Heights, arguably in the New York City area, as you mentioned earlier. They also had the opportunity, if they had pursued Washington a little bit faster with more energy across northern New Jersey before Trenton, to also catch him at various spots.
Yeah.
There was also, when you talk about Saratoga, there was a lot of mix-up in command and communications and expectations. about who was going where and whether or not Burgoyne would get support up the Hudson or not. And after a while, it starts to appear to me that the common denominator of all those almost win is William Howe. Um, and I think some of the more recent studies, there's a new book that came out recently called Whispers Across the Atlantic, and the Howe brothers, the Howe dynasty. Well, what are your thoughts on Howe? He was the commander in chief from basically late 75 until early 78. It's a long time, and yet uh, never really finished things up. Is he the reason, or was it just a tough war to win?
Well, both of those things are true. He was a big reason, but it was a tough war to win. Little sidetrack here. Howe's brother William was the head of the Navy when, I'm sorry, his brother Richard was the head of the Navy in the American War at the same time that William Howe was head of the Army. But they had another brother who, this is one of those cases where his first name now escapes me, but he was an older brother who was a great general and military leader, loved by his men, probably a lot smarter than William, although not necessarily Dick Howe. And he was killed in the French and Indian War at another battle I'd never heard of before I started traveling, but a big battle called the Battle of Carillon, which was at Fort Ticonderoga, what became known as Fort Ticonderoga. And, it was kind of a joke, but I said, well, if he's not killed there, he's probably commanding at the beginning of the revolution, and maybe things happen differently. Howe was traumatized by Bunker Hill. He led the assault at Bunker Hill. His idea was to send people around. It wasn't a stupid frontal assault like some people think it was, but the flanking attack was rebuffed thanks to John Stark in part, and also an unsung hero named Thomas Knowlton. And so he lost half his officers, almost half his men, maybe more than half, killed or wounded. And really, he did not want that to happen again. So when he gets to Long Island and he's confronted with Washington's men who've retreated with their backs against the wall, but they've got some fortifications, he says, well, let's just have a siege. They can't go anywhere. And that didn't turn out so well. So many things about New Jersey that could have been happened differently, but one of which is Henry Clinton, who I think was the smartest British general, high-ranking British general in the war, without much competition. He said, gosh, let me get in boats and drop me off. I've forgotten exactly where, but between Washington and where he was retreating to. And Howe said, no, we need a secure harbor for the Navy. So why don't you go to Rhode Island instead? And, they did need a secure harbor for the Navy, but my goodness. And Howe made many other mistakes. So I think that he's a big factor. But you can also argue, which is something I did not, because that's not the kind of book I was writing, but you can argue that it was an unwinnable war. The communication lines were too long, the logistics were too problematic, the country was too big, and that's a valid argument. It's much easier to blame Howe.
It is. Did you find, while you were just reading, writing, and it takes a lot of thinking to write these books, so that did you find anybody who you felt like you had known something about, and it turns out they were kind of overrated in past histories and American lore and what we celebrate?
Yes. Let me start with George Washington. This is certainly not original with me, but George Washington was greatly overrated as a battlefield general, and I think considerably overrated as a strategist. But on the battlefield, he was terrible. He didn't have a lot of experience. He'd been in the French and Indian War, which had started with him doing something very foolish and ended him with him behaving very heroically at Braddock's defeat, where he had nothing to do with the command. He was an observer. He did a good job training the Virginia militia, but that's not battlefield stuff. So, and he knew this at the beginning of the war. He knew that he wasn't prepared, and he was straightforward about it. But he's overrated, and the reason we call him the father of our country is partly that he was in charge during the war. It's partly that he was politically very astute during the war, as regards his relationship with Congress and with various threats that he fended off. And he was a remarkable first president. So that's why he's the father of our country, not because he won battles. The other person I would mention is Lafayette, because we love Lafayette in America because he came from France when he was 19 and wanted to help us out. But did he help us out? That's a little more complicated. I would argue that he was a threat to the success of the American army until his last campaign, which I don't have to tell John Moss about because he is the author of a best-selling book, or the best-selling book on Lafayette's last campaign. And as he pointed out, it's the only book on Lafayette's. But even there, he came very close to having his head handed to him at a tiny battle called Green Spring. So great guy, became very close to Washington. When Washington turned him loose on the battlefield, which he did largely for political reasons because he wanted help getting France to come in and stay in, he was a menace. Is that too far?
No, and on the flip side, you mentioned that you had started to keep a list of people that you were coming across called unknown dudes who saved the revolution. So who's your top unknown dude and why?
My top unknown dude is a man called James Livingston. And, give yourself points if you've heard of him, because I certainly had when I started. He has some backstory, but by the time we're talking about, he was commanding at a place called Verplanck if I'm pronouncing that correctly, on the Hudson River, which guards an extremely important crossing of the Hudson River. And the reason he's my top choice is that, as everyone knows, Benedict Arnold turned traitor. That is a very long story, which I won't go into, but he was working for the British, and what they had decided to do was to have Arnold surrender West Point to the British, and West Point was the key to the Hudson River, which, rightly or wrongly, the British had thought for the entire war was the key strategic point. And that plot was very far along. The only thing that needed to happen was that one of Henry Clinton's aides, a man named John Andre, had to go and nail down a few details with Arnold. So they arranged a meeting. And utterly coincidentally, Andre was dropped off by a British warship, not too far from Verplanck. Utterly coincidentally, for possibly complicated reasons. It's often said that James Livingston was just annoyed by the presence of the British warship so close to him. But there's a more interesting possible backstory to that. Livingston sent a couple of cannon and a howitzer, if I'm not mistaken, down to take pot shots at this British ship. And they were close enough so that some of them hit the British ship, and the captain was even hit by a splinter. And so he moved the ship. And long story short, he moved the ship. Andre could not be rowed back to the ship, which is what was supposed to happen. So he had to travel back to New York by land. He traveled in disguise, which was bad enough. But he also traveled with the plans to West Point in his boot, which was something that was incredibly stupid but which Arnold had urged him to do. It was stupid because they had Arnold's signature on them, and he could have memorized the important stuff. And when Andre was captured by what one marker calls, quote, 3 honest militiamen, unquote, who were lurking in the no man's land between the armies, and about whom there is dispute to this day about whether they were heroes or not. They caught him and they turned him over, and eventually Washington found out about the plot, and Arnold fled, and that's a big turning point, and it would not have happened without James Livingston.
What impression did you form during your work on the book about Nathaniel Greene? He was really a protege of Washington. In his independent command in the South, he was hard pressed to come up with what could really be called a clear-cut victory, and yet, he's the hero in the South for perseverance. And what did you think, or what do you think of the whole Greene story, and what did you come across when you were down south looking for Nathaniel Greene?
Well, Nathaniel Greene is you could argue that he was the best significant general on the American side in the whole war. You could make a case for Daniel Morgan, but he wasn't as big a deal as Greene in terms of the commands he was given. And you could probably make a case for some other people as well. But I'm going to skip ahead to Greene being sent to the South, because the most important thing that happened, well, I'm not going to skip ahead. He made a terrible mistake during the New York campaign, at the end of the New York campaign, where he believed that a fort in Manhattan could be held, and it could not. And a couple thousand men were captured. It was really a huge blow, and he was completely mortified by that. But Washington kept him on because he understood how valuable he was for other reasons, one of which was logistics. He was great at it. And in Valley Forge, one of the things that happened was the army was not getting fed, and the quartermaster position was empty, and there was a lot of chaos around that. And Washington twisted Greene's arm and made him the quartermaster general, and he didn't want to, because he wanted to be a battlefield guy, but that it was incredibly important what he did. But when he gets sent south, he's sent as I forget whether it's the second or third. There are 2 major commanders down south who weren't there anymore because they got beaten. Greene goes down with basically one more chance. And the thing about that is, I'm not sure whether Washington would have wanted to micromanage him, but he couldn't. He's too far away. So Greene is on his own. And he makes decision after decision based on understanding that if he lost another army in the South, that was really going to be bad. And so the losses that you refer to, technically, if you don't hold the battlefield, it's a really silly thing that they believed in the 18th century, which is that you win the battle if you're sitting on the battlefield at the end of it, which is problematic. But that never happened to Greene. He was never sitting on the battlefield at the end of it because, for one reason or another, he pulled his troops out because he didn't want to risk losing the army. And that takes a lot of guts and a lot of fortitude and a lot of intelligence. And he was more, he hated it. He hated doing that. He wanted to be a battlefield hero, but he did the right thing.
Uh, what what is your impression after your research on the French involvement? When we go back to the kind of the post World War II historiography, a lot of that starts out with almost a altruistic motive on the part of the French to help this nation who is rebelling against their main enemy. But things are a little bit more complex. What did you find, uh, about the French decision to involve themselves in the American side officially, and certainly Yorktown and the naval engagements? What do you think? What did you come to the conclusions about that?
Well, there was nothing altruistic about what the French wanted to do. They didn't care, or maybe they even didn't want the revolution to succeed on one level, but they wanted the British to lose because they were bitter enemies and they had been crushed in the previous war. And the most important thing to know about the French is that we would not have won the war without them. And that is a thing that Americans, for the most part, either don't know or don't remember. And at one point I made a list, and I think it's too long to go through, but it was just a list of all the things that had to happen for the Battle of Yorktown to take place. And it starts back about more than a year earlier, when the French sent Comte de Rochambeau and 5,000 or 6,000 guys to Rhode Island, who and a few ships, and they didn't do much for the next year except prevent Washington from stupidly attacking New York. But as the French then sent a much bigger navy, which is thing number one, that Yorktown couldn't have happened without. And in order for that navy to get here and be effective at the right time, there's just an impossibly long list of things that had to go right. And then once they got to the Chesapeake, where Cornwallis had holed up, they had to go out and fight a British fleet, which wasn't quite as strong as they were, but pretty close. And the British were supposed to be the best naval force in the world. And, that battle was essentially a draw, but that was good enough, because the British could not dislodge the French from the Chesapeake and Yorktown, and eventually Cornwallis had to surrender. We know about that. So I haven't begun to touch all of the things that the French did. Before they officially came into the war, they sent a lot of arms and ammunition that were important, and it's not like the people in the American army were not, and the people fighting here were not doing their best and doing good things, but they needed that help.
All right. My last question / comment that I'll ask you to expand upon a little bit is, one of the things I enjoyed was seeing the people. As you said, you wanted to talk to the people who were experts on the various events. And you got to really go to the sites to find a lot of those folks. And you mentioned you and I have already mentioned Eric, Jim Pikich, and also in your book, you spoke a long time about cow pens with Steve Roush, and Camden with Charles Baxley. It seems like there's a crew in every campaign, studying the campaign, who's really, really knowledgeable about those campaigns, and not in an antiquarian way or bullets and buttons way, but they know the ground. And I'm thinking of the Trenton Mafia, so to speak. But how important is it that many of these men and women know so much, or have not published in a broad sense, although now with various websites it's easier for them to do so. How important is it for historians, including the well-known ones, to enlist those folks to get the details right?
Well, I think it's very important. It's hard to answer that question without sounding self-aggrandizing, because that, of course, is what I did, was enlist them to try to get the details right. It's also true that I did a lot of reading of other historians, both to cross-check what my sources had told me, and I had to make up my own mind what I thought. And I thought the Battle of Second Trenton was the most important part of that campaign, and that came from me figuring it out. But those people are enormously knowledgeable. They're enormously helpful. Some of them gave me great tours. Some of them just talked to me, and I had I want to say this in a way that makes it sound entirely positive, which it is. But when I was going down south, I would come back and I would talk to my wife about what had gone on, and I had a shorthand for 3 or 4 of the people who were just unbelievably helpful in the South. And I just called them the obsessive guys. The obsessive guys told me this, the obsessive guys told me that, the obsessive guys said, don't bother with that, do this instead, and they're just enormously helpful. And if you're somebody, a well-known historian publishing a big book on the war, you can't necessarily do what I did. What I did was different, and they do a great job. Those guys, the more standard historians, but I was completely dependent on those people.
Okay, we got some questions, Bob. One of them is on Benedict Arnold. Was Arnold the best battlefield commander for the Americans? How much blame does Congress and politics deserve for his treason?
Wow. He has often been called, for the first part of the war, when he was a battlefield general for the Americans, he's often been called the best battlefield general. And I'm not actually going to argue with that. What I would argue with is the notion that other people were responsible for his treason, because Arnold was a very touchy individual. He for reasons which some people have speculated intelligently about, he grew up as somebody who couldn't stand being dissed, as we say now. And that is a big reason that he ended up committing treason, because he felt that was happening. He also needed money. Some people feel that the only reason that he committed treason was that he needed money. He said that he changed his stripes because he ceased to believe that the war was a good thing and didn't trust Congress to do it right. I've forgotten exactly what he said. And what I ended up feeling about him was that, even though I'd spent a lot of time reading and thinking about him, I don't know why he became a traitor. There's a lot of factors, but it wasn't just because Congress was mean to him.
In your studies, did you find that the roads, which were important to the Revolutionary War, also played key roles in the Civil War? Or did the introduction of railroads for troop movement and logistics lead to shifts in which older roads played key roles?
Let me start by saying that I'm interested in the Civil War. I'm by no means an expert. It's clearly the case that railroads and other more modernized forms of transportation, even just the existence of more and better roads, made a huge difference. But did troops go up and down the Shenandoah Valley in both wars. Yeah, I think my answer to the question is, one, I don't know enough to answer it, but two, things were very different by the time the Civil War came along.
Right.
Logistics and transportation.
Right. Okay. Another question. Are you working on another book now? And if so, what are you working on?
I am not working on another book now, partly because this one took me 8 years and I owe 4 of them back to my wife. But also because this project was a great deal of fun. I'm very happy I did it. I'm proud of it. It was too big. I mean, I have a tendency to want to do bigger things rather than smaller things, and I probably can't do that again. So I haven't figured out what I'm going to do next is the answer.
So, Bob, wrapping it all up, let me just make sure everybody knows, if you haven't read this book, it's fantastic. It really grabs you. And from my perspective, it had a great balance of not too much detail, just enough detail, but lots of good stuff about what you were finding, but also what you were thinking. And as you were talking to these historians and thinking it all through, I think that it was a real aspect of the book that readers don't get anywhere else. So congratulations on the project and the book, and we thank you for being with us here tonight with the National Army Museum.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Okay, folks, thank you to our audience for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in another program. So with that, we'll say good night, and thanks again, Bob.